All right, hello everybody, and welcome to today's Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center webinar. Today we are continuing what will be a four-part series of webinars exploring different crash scenarios involving bicyclists, pedestrians, and motorists. You may have joined us a few months back where we talked about the motorist overtaking bicyclist crash type, and we also talked about the multiple threat crash involving pedestrians at uncontrolled locations. So today what we're going to do is dig into a common type of crash that involves left-turning motorists and pedestrians at intersections. We're going to be talking about the crash scenario, what we know about it, and how we can use different strategies to prevent it from happening. My name is Dan Jeline, and I will be facilitating the session today. I'd like to introduce you to the panelists that we have joining us, Libby Thomas, David Hurwitz, Chris Monsieur, and Bradley Topol. First up is Libby Thomas. She is a senior research associate at the Highway Safety Research Center at UNC Chapel Hill, where her primary focus areas include bicycle and pedestrian safety and speed management, and understanding the complex interplay of factors leading to crashes and injuries. She's conducted pedestrian and bicyclist safety and access research and worked with agency representatives and project staff to develop evidence-based case studies, published guides, and interactive tools and resources to help states and communities make safety improvements. Most recently, she was part of a team that developed a systemic risk-based safety assessment process and data needs for agencies interested in implementing a more proactive approach to address future pedestrian crash potential. Dr. David Hurwitz is an associate professor of transportation engineering and director of the Driving and Bicycling Research Laboratory in the School of Civil and Construction Engineering at Oregon State University. David also serves as the associate director at OSU for the Pacific Northwest Transportation Consortium, conducting research in the areas of transportation human factors, traffic control, transportation safety, driving and bicycle simulation, and engineering education. In particular, Dr. Hurwitz is interested in the consideration of user behavior in the design and innovation of transportation systems. Dr. Chris Monsieur is professor and chair of civil and environmental engineering at Portland State University. Dr. Monsieur is a member of the Transportation Research Board's Bicycle Transportation Committee, the past co-chair of the Safety Data Analysis and Evaluation Committee, and the task force to develop the Highway Safety Manual. Dr. Monsieur received his bachelor's from the University of Detroit Mercy, a master's and PhD from Iowa State University, and is a licensed professional engineer in the state of Oregon. We're also joined by Bradley Topol, who's a project coordinator for the Seattle Department of Transportation. Bradley has 7 years of experience in designing complete streets and leading all-day training seminars on pedestrian and bicycle safety treatments. He currently focuses on Vision Zero work in an effort to eliminate all traffic fatalities and serious crashes in the city of Seattle. Bradley has previously worked for the Federal Highway Administration and Chicago DOT. We're really excited and grateful to have all of our panelists joining us today. I'm not going to try not to take too much time telling you about a little bit of housekeeping, things that you might need to keep in mind if this is your first PBIC webinar. You'll note that as attendees, you won't be able to speak up during the webinar, but you do have the ability to send in your questions and your comments using the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. I'll respond to those as I'm able to, and I'm actually going to be tagging and flagging questions for the discussion period that we're going to hold at the end, probably about 30 minutes or so to respond to your questions. So keep those coming in all throughout the presentation. A couple of things will be available online for your reference. One will be a PDF copy of the slide deck we're using today. That's actually already posted at pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. I'll send out the link in just a moment to where you can find that information. We'll follow up with an email later today that'll have that link, some more resources for you, a webinar recording of the session, which should be available a little bit later today, as well as a link to where you can download a certificate of attendance for the webinar. I'll note that the webinar has also been posted or submitted to the American Planning Association for consideration of 1.5 CM credits. So if you're a planner and you plan to capture those credits, please just log into their event page and you can find them there. PBIC has a lot of webinars coming up. In fact, a couple next week that I'll tell you about shortly. If you want to stay up to date on the webinars we have going on, you can look at our website, pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. You can follow us on social media. Our handles are there, and we're actually talking about this one today using hashtag PBIC webinar if you'd like to join in that. And then you can also sign up for our mailing list to get our quarterly newsletter and all of our webinar announcements. The webinars coming up next week, we've got two one on Tuesday comes first, the rectangular rapid flashing beacon. We're leading this webinar with Tool Design Group and FHWA as part of FHWA's Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian program. So if you want to learn more about the RRFB, please join us then. And then on Wednesday, we'll be talking about a new guide that's going to be coming out from FHWA on strategies for accelerating project delivery, especially multimodal projects involving bicyclist and pedestrian elements. So please join us then. That one's on Wednesday. Both of those webinars are free to sign up for, so you can follow that link to learn more and register. I wanted to just share briefly before we turn it over to Libby Thomas a little bit more kind of visual depiction of the crash type we're talking about today. These left turning crashes involving motorists and pedestrians, as Libby will share more detail on, tend to happen at these signalized intersection locations where you see a pedestrian crossing and a driver waiting to make that left turn. What we have happening then is the driver looking for that traffic or otherwise focused on something other than the pedestrian when making the left turn, ultimately turning and possibly striking the pedestrian. This is sort of a quick snapshot of what we're trying to talk about today and address. Libby's going to talk a little bit now about what we know about this crash type using data from a few different sources and its magnitude and some other factors. So Libby, whenever you're ready, please go right ahead.
All right, thank you, Dan. So yeah, we'll get right into it. It's Dan. I appreciate being here and talking a little bit about what we can learn about the crash type from data sources. So if you want to go ahead and advance. So I just wanted to share with you in this first slide, there's a lot of numbers on that page, but we're using data today. We're talking about data from FARS, that's the Fatality Analysis and Reporting System, which compiles data on fatalities, on fatal crashes from all the states and territories. So these are the data we're using. I've highlighted the pedestrian rows in each of these years. So we're using data from 2014, 15, and 16. And I'll explain the reasons for that in just a minute. We're including the data for persons on personal conveyances because those data, that's where people using assistive devices, skateboards, skates, and other types of personal vehicles like that. They can be motorized, but they can't be involve pedals and such. But that's where those data are currently collected by Federal Highway, and I think those people need to be included. They're not typically included in most NHTSA reports, though. So, yeah, as you can see, the numbers are fairly small compared to all pedestrians. All right, next slide. I'll also be talking a little bit, making some comparisons with data from North Carolina. So North Carolina is a state that has been coding pedestrian and bicycle crash types going back to 1997. So it's a good source of data on all reported pedestrian and bicycle injuries, whereas the FARS data reports just on the fatal crashes. And so we're using both of those data sources to have a look at what's going on. You can see the light blue highlighted sections of these columns at the bottom. Those are the total numbers of motorist left turn parallel path crashes in this data set for North Carolina. So that means, well, I'll explain it in just a minute. So just looking broadly at the U.S. pedestrian fatalities, it's largely an urban problem, even though we know that fatalities tend to be somewhat overrepresented. They're more severe in rural areas based on the total numbers of crashes in rural areas. But as you see, about 3/4 of pedestrian fatalities actually occur in developed or partly developed areas within urban areas. And among those, though, the non-intersection locations represent the largest portion. So it's an urban problem, but often a problem that occurs at places where people don't expect pedestrians at non-intersections. However, and again, this just illustrates the rural nature of the problem again, with 74% of the total being urban. This is for all the fatalities. Next slide. But for this crash type, it's even a larger percent are urban. So 90% of this type of crash occur in urban areas, and that makes sense when we look at the type of location that Dan just talked about. Go ahead. So this just represents these data again, the numbers and relative frequencies of this crash. The motorist left turn parallel paths. There are two types which I wanted to show. These are both types involving motorists turning left. And the top row where they're turning left, that means we'll show you an illustration of it in just a minute. But the motorist and the pedestrian are initially on parallel paths before the motorist turns. And the bottom one, they're on perpendicular paths. So that means the pedestrian is crossing in front of the motorist at an angle before the motorist actually makes their turn. So you can see the largest percentage of the problem is the top problem, the motorist left turn parallel paths. That accounts for 3%, about 3% of all the U.S. fatalities. It ranks 10th in terms of most frequent crash types, and that's out of about 56 separate individual crash types. In North Carolina, it ranks 4th in all severity of crashes. So this gives us an idea that when you're looking at the frequency of this crash overall, and these are crashes that are reported by state reporting agencies, it's really a prevalent crash type. So, and then we can see, even in rural areas, it ranks in the top third or so out of the total number of different crashes. So it's a frequent crash type. And this is what it looks like. This is the perpendicular path type that we were talking about. So the pedestrians can be coming from either the motorist's right side or left side as the motorist is approaching the intersection and preparing for their left turn. The pedestrian may be violating traffic control. There may not be any control at the location, or there could be a stop sign. But for whatever reason, the motorist there's a conflict there, and that's about 6% of these types of crashes. So our primary focus today, though, is going to be this one, which is the motorist making a left turn across parallel path pedestrians. And again, they can be coming from the near side of the intersection or the far side of the intersection. And this counts for about 94% of this type. So I explored using these data sources, a lot of different factors to see what can we learn just from the variables that are available in crash data. And these are data elements reported to FARS and where we had common elements in North Carolina. Some of these are actually from the crash typing process, which some of you who've been on these earlier webinars may have heard me explain that NHTSA has been coding crash types and reporting these data for about 3 years now. So as I mentioned, it is a big problem at intersections. The remaining 13%, 80% at intersections, 13% near an intersection. That is about 50 feet from the crosswalk area or related to queuing of vehicles and that sort of thing. The remaining small percentage may occur at driveways, such as, to commercial businesses. So 2/3 of the problem occur at signalized locations, and that's we're highlighting there. We're making these comparisons to the light yellow column over there. So those data represent all types of crashes in which pedestrians were crossing a street, regardless of whether the motor vehicle was turning or not, or going straight or turning right. So as you can see, compared to all types of crashes, this crash type really is prevalent at signalized locations. The other things that are prevalent about the problem are that they occur largely during daytime, whereas most of the pedestrian fatalities have about 75% have occurred at night. They occur on low-speed roads even more predominantly than the other crossing crash types. So the other factors that you can see there are kind of interest for what they don't show. They're not on the big median divided roads so much. They may be multi-lane roads, but when I took a look, it does look like most of these crashes occur on streets of 2 lanes. We're not sure how reliable the data are from crash reporting, but that's what it's suggestive of. And so the other folks who are on the webinar today can tell you about what they find when they actually investigate this problem in their community. So those are some of the prevalent characteristics of these crashes. And the other thing that is included through the crash typing process, and some of you may not be aware that it's possible to do this through the PBIC crossing, is to look at more detail about the scenario of this crossing. And so as we mentioned, the pedestrian may be coming from the near side of the intersection or the far side. But this first scenario that's labeled 11B, where the pedestrian is coming from the opposite direction of the motor vehicle, is the largest percentage of the problem. So that really accounts for the hugest percent, much smaller percent, 22% coming from the near side. And then the others we don't know. They may be crossing somewhat outside the crosswalk, that near percentage that we were talking about. And maybe the approach direction is also unknown. So these are some factors related to where and what are the relative maneuvers of people when these types of crashes occur. Finally, we took a look at the age of the pedestrians involved. And so what we see here is comparing the age group of pedestrians involved in this crash type, the blue columns you see there, compared to pedestrian fatalities for all pedestrian fatalities. And what we see is a high overrepresentation of pedestrians 65 and over in this type. So this is a percentage, 55% of these fatalities, and this due to this crash type involve pedestrians 65 years and older. And we know from other studies that older pedestrians tend to cross, they try to cross at intersections and at signalized locations. So this is probably partly in relation to their exposure. They tend to be at these locations more prevalently and less likely to cross at other kinds of unsignalized locations. But it also may be partly a factor of their frailty and inability to get out of the way when a vehicle is turning and maybe accelerating into their turn. They think they've gotten, they've identified a gap, they're looking at oncoming traffic, and they start to make that turn and start accelerating. And the pedestrians just don't have enough chance to get out of the way.
Libby, this is a really compelling graph. When I saw this, it really jumped out to me, and I wondered if it could also be something about an older person taking a longer time to get across, if they maybe don't have the length of the signal or some other factor. Do you think that plays into this at all?
That's another form of exposure. As we saw, pedestrians are most often in the far, they're just starting their crossing from the far side. Most often, I didn't actually look at the interaction of that by age. So, but it could be a mix of that, or it just takes them longer to get into the crosswalk too, and to be noticed, to be out there. It could be any number of factors related to exposure and also the increasing frailty of people as they get older. Thanks, Dan. So just to summarize, and this is just a really big picture look, because as I mentioned, crash data, the last bullet here, crash data isn't really sufficient for assessing many of these types of risk factors. So this, such as the facilities present, what was the traffic control operations like? Were there any signal timing strategies in place there? How wide are the crossings? What are the opposing traffic volumes? And so the kinds of gaps that the motorists are dealing with and trying to make left turns. So all of these could come into play in this kind of crash. But in summary, most of these occur on lower speed roads up to 35 miles per hour, 3/4 of them during daylight hours, which is atypical for pedestrian fatalities. They occur at signalized locations and on two-way undivided facilities by and large. But it's still a really common crash type, and as a result, we see a significant percentage of all U.S. pedestrian fatalities resulting from that. So with 3% of all fatalities being this parallel path type. And it appears to be even more frequent among all severity of crashes, as I mentioned, using the data for North Carolina and looking especially at just urban areas in North Carolina. We know North Carolina may not be representative of all states, but we have a lot of cities in North Carolina to provide some idea of what may be happening in terms of the frequency of this crash type. And so again, the most common scenario involves that pedestrian approaching in a crosswalk from the opposite direction to the turning motorist. And now I'm happy to turn it over to the rest of the presenters to talk about what they know about this problem.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Libby. That was a great way to start things out, looking at some data and getting our heads wrapped around the scope of the problem. What I'm going to do now is turn it right over to our team from both Oregon State and Portland State, who are going to continue the presentations. Dave, the screen will be coming to you, and I'll as I do that, I actually need to go ahead, and I forgot to take a poll earlier, so let me get into that really quickly. I was supposed to ask you all to answer a question for us, and that question is just letting us know about how many people are out there. So let's go ahead and take care of this poll. Let us know if it's just you or a few others in your office. I'd like to get your opinions on that. I just want to say, for those of you, as you're casting your vote, the information that Libby went through today is all captured in the archive slide material that we've already posted on our website. So if you want to dig back through some of that, I suggest taking a look at our slides, and I sent a link out earlier. I'll do that again. I also suggest maybe even if you're so inclined and have some of the technical capability, to maybe visit the FAR's website to maybe dig around. Your state may have its own database of crash data where maybe they've typed this information. You may be able to explore more local sources and see maybe how your numbers compare to some of these. But I did want to let you know that this information has been posted on our website. So some of those tables did have a lot there. So go back and dig through that and use it, maybe understand it a little more, and then reach out to us. Libby, I'm sure we'll be glad to help answer any other questions as we get through that. So I'm going to close the poll now. I see that there are some questions coming in. We are going to hold a few of those for the discussion period at the end, but as I move the screen over to Dave, and Dave, I'll let you know when I see your slide. We already got several questions about flashing yellow arrow. So I thought, wow, I really planned this well, because the next presentation is going to dive right into that topic, among other things. So Dave Hurwitz and Chris Montier, please go ahead and take it from here whenever you're ready.
Okay, thanks, Dan. So we're gonna kind of tag team this presentation. I'll take the front end, and then Dave Hurwitz from Oregon State will take the back end. So this is Chris Montier from Portland State speaking. So Libby, thanks for setting the background with the data. We're gonna kind of dive in to a driving simulator experiment that we conducted looking at the flashing yellow arrow and its relationship to this crash type. So, Dave, why don't you go ahead and bump the slide? Okay, so the background, right, for this crash type is that for a driver trying to make a permissive left turn, and we're going to be focusing on a driver making a permissive left turn from a separate left turn bay, needs to find gaps in the opposing traffic, both vehicles and bicycles and pedestrians in the crosswalk. And what we know from our work and from others' work is that the driver often focuses this search and gap decision-making process on the motor vehicles. And as the workload increases, drivers often don't scan for pedestrians, check for pedestrians. They're focused on finding the gaps in vehicles. And this can become a particular issue where the driver expectations of pedestrians is low. So, the background and the motivations for our work is, we are looking, Oregon was an early adopter of the flashing yellow arrow for permissive left turns. So there's quite a bit of an experience here using this indication. And we weren't interested when we did this work in sort of looking at alternatives for that display. And clearly the research has sort of shown that the FYA is is the superior sort of indication for communicating permissive movements. But we really wanted to take a dive into looking at how the flashing yellow arrow might affect the driver's behavior in the presence of pedestrians. And we really wanted to look at this sort of, this is a little bit down in the weeds of traffic engineering, but down into the effect of whether you could have a 4 or a 3 section head. And both of those topics have sort of haven't been explored as much in the research prior to our work. So in terms of the next slide here, sort of just, and there's a lot of detail on here, and we really don't need to focus on it too much, other than that we were specifically looking at the differences in driver behavior and performance when they were presented with a 4-section head or they were presented with a 3-section head. But as you'll see, as what Dave's going to present, that ended up not being very significant in the work, but how drivers reacted to pedestrians we gathered quite a bit of information about that. So, so now I'm going to turn it over to Dave to talk about the driving simulator experiment.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Chris. And it's probably worth a comment that at the time that this work was being conducted, the recommended practice was the use of that type 1 condition, the 4-section vertical head. The interim approval for a bimodal had not yet been released. This was work that was done about 18 months before that had happened, that statement from Federal Highway. So because we're dealing with a complex, high-risk, multimodal crash scenario, we thought that a preliminary investigation in the safety of a human-in-the-loop simulator might be a good way to gather some data evaluating some novel traffic control devices. So we came to the driving simulator lab here at OSU. This is based on the configuration of the lab at the time we conducted the research. So our lab at the time included a full-scale driving simulator. The cab that the driver interacted with was a 2009 Ford Fusion. That cab sat on a partial motion base. It's an electric pitch system. So the vehicle pivots plus or minus 4 degrees point of the driver's eye, so that on tangent segments of roadway, we can generate pretty clean and authentic to real world acceleration and deceleration profiles. The visual field is constructed with 180 degrees of forward vision distributed across 3 flat panel projection screens. If you're sitting in the driver's seat and you look in the center rear view mirror, there is a rear projector screen that envelops the entire rear window, so you can see the virtual world behind you. And if you look in the side view mirrors, there are LCD screens that represent your rear view as well. This is an image of the operator station. Interestingly, this entire lab now exists in a brand new building with lots of other bells and whistles, but this was our configuration at the time we were conducting this research. In addition to the driving simulator equipment, we're also interested in the visual attention of road users. For this particular experiment, we were using eye tracking equipment that was head mounted and monocular in nature. That means that our users were wearing a pair of sports goggles with 2 cameras mounted to them. One camera was called the scene camera that captures a visual record of everything the driver saw pointing away from the sports goggles. The second camera uses infrared light beams, 3, that are reflected off the pupil of the driver's eye. And this equipment allows us to record the visual attention of subjects. Very specifically, it measures the fixations that the user experiences. So when we think about visual attention, our eyes move in one of 2 big categories of ways. They fixate at particular locations for some duration of time. We call those fixations, and we set the time threshold for this particular investigation at 1/10 of a second. So any glance towards a particular location for 1/10 of a second or more, that registers as a fixation. We measure those empirically with this equipment. The pathway between fixations, the movements, the quick movements between fixations, we call those saccades. Those are extrapolated based on the XY coordinates of fixations in sequence This particular set of equipment was produced by ASL Applied Science Laboratories. The driving simulator is a real-time technologies system. So what does it look like when we put those two pieces of equipment together? This is a video clip of a beta test of one of the scenarios that we designed. So we're looking at the virtual environment from the perspective of the road user. The crosshairs that are bouncing around the screen, those are records of individual fixations. So each time the crosshair focuses, that's a representation of an individual fixation. We can see a digital instrument, and we have complete control over the development of the virtual world. This is an example of a driver situating themselves in an exclusive left turn bay and waiting to find an acceptable gap in both conflicting pedestrian movements in the conflicting crosswalk, as well as conflicting vehicular movements in the opposing through direction, while being presented a flashing yellow arrow display. Okay, so what sorts of variables worked their way into this particular experiment? This experiment was a factorial design. There were 3 independent variables, each at different levels. We counterbalanced the levels of those independent variables, so every combination was represented in the experiment, and this was a within subject design. That means that each driver saw every combination of variable level. So a 4x3x2 factorial design resulted in 24 individual scenarios. They were counterbalanced and then partially randomized. Okay, so in terms of crossing pedestrians, we had a condition with no peds, a condition where a single pedestrian was walking towards the vehicle, a condition where the ped was walking away, and then we had a case where 2 peds were crossing the conflicting crosswalk in both directions. We were interested in the influence of opposing vehicles. We had a case with no vehicles, one with 3 vehicles in the standing queue, and another with 9. And then we had 2 configurations of the flashing yellow arrow, one with a 3-section bimodal presentation and one with a 4-section. Chris was talking about that as one of the traffic engineering questions that we were particularly interested in. Was there an effect in those 2 different cases? Here's some information on the individual displays and the sequence of indications that we used for both the 4-section vertical and then that 3-section bimodal lens. At the time we were doing this work, which is a couple of years back, bimodal lenses for FYA applications were more novel than they are today. We didn't have interim approval as of yet. So as we translate all of that into the individual scenarios that our subjects were exposed to, here are some examples of the renderings from those environments. So an example with a single pedestrian in the conflicting walkway, another with 4 peds walking in both directions, a condition with no peds, which basically gave us a control to benchmark the other visual search tasks against, and then a condition where 1 ped's walking towards our subject vehicle. We selected intersection config that were pretty similar to some real-world test cases. For this particular project, we had colleagues in Washington County that had been playing with the wide-scale adoption of FYAs in and around the 2009, 2010, 2011 timeframe, and they had some instances where they wanted to better understand how the drivers were interacting with pedestrians. So we selected one of their intersection environments to render. Next to that, you're looking at an example of one of the test tracks. So these 24 individual scenarios were distributed across a series of test tracks. This particular example had 6 testable left turns, and we randomly seeded each one of those left turns with one of those scenarios of interest from the factorial design. So what sort of data did we get back? Well, we saw an example of the raw video files collected from our eye tracking equipment. This speaks to how we can process that. So we define areas of interest, or AOIs, and those are different targets in the visual field that we're interested in. For this particular experiment, we cared about glances and fixations on the conflicting vehicles, the PEDs in the crosswalk, the PED signal heads, the vehicular signal heads, and so on. With the best technology available even today, a few years later, you still have to do a lot of that coding manually. So that means going in frame by frame and drawing in those polygon areas of interest, every handful of visual images, every handful of frames. For this particular experiment, we used 5-frame sequences to get us higher fidelity. So what are our specific research hypotheses and what kinds of data did we draw? So one topic was related to trying to differentiate the implications of this 4-section versus 3-section vertical signal head. So was there a difference in giving the signal head change for the presentation of the FYA or running the bimodal in the lower section? So we had 2 signal configurations of interest, and then all of those areas of visual attention. So did the shifting of the traffic signal heads influence the visual search task while a driver was performing their permitted left turn? Here we're looking at the distribution of average total fixation durations for each one of those areas of interest. So there's an awful lot of data here, but we're looking at generally a range of 0 to 6 seconds during one of these permitted left turn scenarios, visual attention that's distributed across the areas of interest. On the vertical axis, we have areas of interest we considered, as well as the number of fixations that were recorded in total for the entire sample size. And then the horizontal bars are the differentiation between the 3 and the 4-section signal head, as well as the p-values for the statistical testing. The key takeaway from all of that information is that there was no differentiation in the visual search task between drivers responding to a 3-section versus a 4-section signal head. They didn't spend more or less time looking at any one of those areas of interest. Okay. So beyond how the visual search task was distributed during the permitted left turn, we're pretty interested in the relative position of the pedestrian in the conflicting crosswalk and our left turning vehicles during the permitted phase of the indication. At this time, we broke down the pedestrian position by lane number. So relatively speaking, where were they in the crosswalk? And so here a second question became, well, the visual attention's not any different between those 2 signal heads. Could we differentiate differences between where the PED was in the crosswalk and when the left turn maneuver began as we change signal head? And so that's what we're looking at here across the 4 pedestrian cases of interest. And what we found is there was no difference in the position of the pedestrians between the 2 signal heads when the PEDs were walking towards the vehicle, or in both directions towards the vehicle, or both away. But there was a statistically significant difference when one pedestrian was walking away from the vehicle. So technically, it trips statistical difference, but the actual position there is almost identical. So while statistically significant, that may not be practically significant. The third question that we embedded in the investigation was asking, did the drivers detect the presence of the pedestrian? Did they fixate on those conflicting pedestrians in the conflicting crosswalk? And so we break down the number of exposures, and we see that between 4 to 7% of the time, our left-turning vehicles did not fixate on any of the pedestrians in the conflicting crosswalk. And we conducted proportions testing and found no statistical differences between either the 3-section signal head or the 4-section signal head in comparing those alternatives. It's not statistically significant. There is a % of the time where the drivers aren't actively searching for the presence of pedestrians in that conflicting crosswalk. So in terms of conclusions, at the time when we conducted the experiment, there was a gap in research. Folks were looking for guidance on whether a 3-section signal head would be adequate in these left-turning bay, exclusive left-turning bay scenarios where we were conducting PPLT phasing. So as we think about the performance measures that we collect, we couldn't differentiate in any meaningful way either the response of the driver to starting their left turn in relation to the position of the pedestrian or the active visual search task. There was no difference between either of those measures in the 3 or the 4-section case. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Chris, and Chris is going to talk a little bit about some signal timing countermeasures that have been proposed, at least in the state of Oregon, and implemented with some effect.
Thanks, Dave. So we know that this is an issue at signalized intersections, and allowing a permissive left turn sort of sets up this crash type to happen, right? So obviously, one option that you could do, and the permissive movement, right, is generally driven by the desire to reduce the delay for the left turning vehicles, and probably for all of the vehicles in the intersection. So the data and the research are quite clear that implementing a protected left turn phase where there are no turning vehicles over that pedestrian parallel path is clearly a safer alternative for both the turning vehicles and for the pedestrians. So that's definitely one option. Another option is the leading pedestrian interval, where the pedestrians get a head start 3 to 7 seconds to get out into the crosswalk. And I think if you spend some time and you go back and look at some of the data that we reduced, you'll notice that when there are more pedestrians, the drivers are sort of more likely to search and sort of notice the pedestrians. So both the where the pedestrians are walking and the number of them increases the likelihood that the drivers will notice them. But the LPI might not be as effective for those pedestrians coming from the crossings from behind the driver, or those that are arriving late, because this only helps the pedestrians on the start. So the second or the third option is something that many agencies in Oregon, including the Oregon Department of Transportation, and this is actually first implemented, I think, in Washington County, who we were working with, is to operate the permissive interval with this pedestrian inhibit feature. And on the next slide, I just have a quick graphic about how this sort of works. Dave, can you bump the slide? Okay, so up at the first row sort of shows a protected permissive operation without the pedestrian inhibit function, and it sort of works like we discussed. The vehicles turn on a protected movement, the pedestrians are held, and then the permissive interval, which is shown by that yellow interval, operates, and it's across at the same time as the pedestrian happening. And so we know both from Libby's data and our work, right, that that's setting up a potential crash type to happen. So the solution is to not operate that permissive movement when a pedestrian call is activated. And so this is how many intersections in Oregon are now operating with this protective permissive operation, where it runs the protected for the left turn first. But if there's a pedestrian who has pushed the button for service, the motor vehicles don't get their permissive interval. So the pedestrians get the walk and the flash don't walk. And if there's any time remaining in the cycle, then the flashing yellow arrow comes up. So, and many of these intersections are wide enough, and the timing is such that the vehicles still do get their permissive interval. But with this pedestrian inhibit feature, the pedestrians are guaranteed to not have a conflicting vehicle, a left-turning conflicting vehicle when they have the walk. So, and and you could email us. We could get you more detail about how that operation works, and point you to practicing folks in Washington County or other places with the details of that. So we just want to acknowledge the sponsors that we worked with, the Oregon Transportation Research and Education Center. That was a UTC at the time that both OSU and PSU were participating in. And then the Washington County Traffic Engineering staff and Kittleson Associates were the ones that were working with Washington County on this pedestrian inhibit timing. And actually, Sean Quayle is now at Washington County. So just the last thing, just to leave you with some references that David and I have been working on a number of topics related to multimodal intersections. And we've got a number of papers for both left turns and pedestrians with the flashing yellow arrow, right turns and bicycles, and then some of our latest work has been on right turns and pedestrians, also looking at the flashing yellow arrow for right turns. So, and we have our contact information on the slides. And so with that, I think I'm going to turn it, I think Bradley is up next to talk about the Seattle experience.
Great, thank you so much, both of you, for that awesome presentation. I think you covered a lot of different topics there, but I really like the kind of the human factors focus and using some of that simulator technology to better understand this problem. I think is really cool. We are going to continue to accept your questions. Please keep sending those in if you have them. I'm moving the presentation over. We're going to visit Seattle, Washington next and hear from Bradley about some of the work they're doing at Seattle DOT on this problem. So Bradley, when you're ready, if you want to go ahead and take control, and we can move right into your presentation. All right, you're all set. Oh, Bradley, you may still be on mute. Check that mute button real quick. Yeah, Bradley, you're still muted. That telephone button in the upper left-hand corner of your control panel. If you click that, it should work. Oh, there you go. Sorry about that.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, sorry. It said I had to wait for you to unmute me there for a second. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure being able to present on kind of some of the on-ground improvements based off of a lot of the data from Portland State and Oregon, as well as the UNC. So starting off a little bit about Seattle, just in general, kind of some overarching trends as specific to pedestrian intersection crashes. Over the last 8 years, we've had, it's been kind of up and down, which kind of loosely follows the kind of national trends for pedestrian crashes across the country. Specifically at signalized intersections, we've been seeing a increase following that and a drop in the last year or two, but similar to the other, research, yes, we have a high volume of left turn crashes. This is all intersections, not just signalized. If you dive into signalized intersections, you see that left turn number go up even higher. It gets closer to 60%, and the right turns will drop down closer to 10% to 8%. So there's a few different types of treatment methods that we can use to reduce crashes in different environments. I'll go over all of these in greater detail, but similar to what Chris and David mentioned earlier, leading pedestrian intervals, left turn signal separation are great treatments to kind of reduce that exposure. You could even go as far as going into full signal separation, where you have completely isolated signal PED phases from vehicular phases, and then kind of getting into some uncontrolled intersection treatments, just the addition of left turn lanes or turn restrictions, or even in a residential context, using traffic circles has a benefit for pedestrians and left turn crashes. So looking at Seattle specifically, kind of the densest, highest PED volume area in the downtown, we have a series of north-south avenues that carry the majority of our pedestrian as well as vehicular and bus traffic downtown. And so kind of in our normal, looking at high crash intersections and specifically pedestrian crash, high crash intersections, we kind of started noticing some interesting patterns downtown and decided to go ahead and plot every ped crash downtown over the last 8 years. And we kind of came up with this. It's tilted on its side a little bit, but you kind of see these, once you start putting things down on paper or plotting them in CAD, suddenly these things pop out immediately, these kind of circulation left turn crash patterns. This displays every single ped crash we have on record for the last 8 years. I also kind of listed for reference, like who's the primary user on that street, at least in the pavement area of the street. Obviously, all of these streets downtown are pedestrian streets, but as you get further to the top of that diagram, you see we have some very car-centric streets. We have the I-5 corridor is right next to 6th Avenue, and so we do have a lot of vehicles kind of coming on and off the interstate there. As we travel farther down, which is to the east, we do have kind of more transit-oriented and bike-oriented streets. Our 3rd Avenue, I think, is one of the heaviest transit streets in the country. It's not 24/7 transit, but it's pretty close to that. Vehicles at specific blocks are allowed to turn right on and right off, but and as time has gone by, we have further restricted private vehicles on that street, but there still is some access. So if we look at the section to the left, which is kind of the north end of our downtown, and kind of zoom in on some of those higher crash intersections, we have some really interesting circulation patterns. This being because it's downtown, we have like one-way and one-way grids for the streets that typically alternate. And we started to notice these patterns where if you can go left, 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 kind of curbside to curbside to curbside, there's much higher volumes of pedestrian left turning crashes than in the same types of block faces where you can go right, 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 right. And so it's just something that kind of popped out to us, and it's kind of helping us lead our conversation for how we're going to target different types of pedestrian improvements at those intersections. The first of which that Chris and David kind of mentioned was a leading pedestrian interval. If you're not familiar with that, essentially you're giving pedestrians a 3 to 7 second head start prior to a green light. But typically after that point, you allow permissive movements from vehicles crossing those intersections. Typically, or at least based on national data provided by the FHWA, there's a 60% reduction in pedestrian vehicle crashes. Some of the other benefits are increased visibility and reinforcing the right-of-way of pedestrians and crosswalks. This may be especially true for platoons of pedestrians in areas where vehicles might try to jump the green light or jump the red light in order to, they see a large volume of pedestrians. They know they're going to have to wait a while to make a left or right turn. And sometimes they may try to jump ahead of that crew, that platoon, to make that turn. So LPIs are great for that type of behavior. What has Seattle shown to date? Right now we have 17 locations installed with another 20 on the way by the end of this year. We've installed 10 this year, so we don't have we have some great before data, but we don't really have any good immediate after data because it takes a while to compile that. But the older locations, we've seen something that matches very similar to that, the FHWA data, which is 40–60% reduction in pedestrian collisions. And as a safety treatment, it can be one of the cheapest safety treatments you can implement across the board for bicycle or pedestrian crash prevention. Ideally, it could cost $0 if you're already doing a project along those corridors or along those intersections where retiming is already being considered. At that point, it's just getting your signal engineers to add in an extra phase for pedestrians, and that's pretty much it. If you're looking at a standalone project, there is probably a cost associated with physically being able to retime it, and maybe you have to replace some pedestrian heads, or there's some other things that have to be, maybe a controller has to get swapped out because it can't handle those extra phases, especially in areas with older signals. But typically still one of the cheapest things you can do that has a high safety benefit. And so kind of one of the more real-life examples where we've implemented this, on our far southeast side, we have a school. We have several schools in the intersection, or the area of Rainier and Henderson. This year, we had 4 individual students that were hit in that area. 3 of them were serious injuries, and so there was a lot of, we suddenly saw this new crash pattern emerging that we hadn't seen previously, and there's a lot of pressure on us to do something about it. Here's an example, or this is the older street view of what the intersection used to look like. Both streets are kind of maybe mid-level collectors. They have probably about 10 to 12,000 ADT on them, 5-lane cross sections. So wide crossings, a lot of turns going on. And so what did we implement there. We did LPIs for every single leg, as well as setting the signals to pedestrian recall. There were elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools in this area. And anecdotally, we don't have any data, but anecdotally, we believe that students may be less likely to hit the pedestrian buttons. We know that even, based on a lot of national studies that I've looked at over the last 10 to 20 years, even for adults and the general population, the highest percentage of pedestrians to hit the push button is about 60%. You only see about 60% of pedestrians using push buttons that aren't set to recall. So putting them on recall brings up the pedestrian phase every time, which means they're also going to be getting that LPI every time as well. In addition, we did a few other things. We widened our crosswalks just to make them more conspicuous. And we also essentially shortened those crossings by turning the right turn lanes, by making the right lanes on one of the cross streets into right turn lanes. And it allowed us to kind of do, at this point, a paint and post curb bulb on the far side, but in the future we'll come back through and maybe do an additional concrete bulb out on those sides to reduce that pedestrian exposure and reduce that crossing distance. Another type of treatment is left turn signal separation. Again, Chris and David mentioned this, adding a left turn arrow at signals instead of using permissive lefts is going to have a benefit. In areas with higher densities of pedestrians, you may want to consider lagging lifts, again, because as you have the don't walk signal, pedestrians will kind of platoon and kind of gather together, and it will reduce the exposure to pedestrians if you kind of release them initially, and you may have lower issues with people not following the pedestrian signal. Again, these can cost somewhere between $20,000 and $80,000. It depends on if you have to implement mast arms or if you have to, add those extra turn signal heads. You're going to have some sort of cost associated with that. I kind of wanted to, I couldn't find any direct data that said if you go from a permissive to a left turn arrow, what is the benefit? So the best thing I could do is jump in the Crash Modification Factor Clearinghouse and look at some studies that were done on, well, what if you went from left turn protected to a flashing yellow arrow? I want to say that flashing yellow arrow obviously has a benefit over permissive phasing, but I just wanted to show something to illustrate that if you go from protected to essentially permissive, you see a increase in crashes in those areas, or a negative crash reduction factor, depending on which study you're looking at. So we have an example of the kind of the pedestrian inhibit function that Chris was talking about earlier. We have a school kind of on our north central side called Daniel Bagley Elementary, and the red line there is what's Aurora Avenue, carries high volumes of vehicles, and we have a lot of students that are crossing that intersection there, and so we got a lot of complaints from the residents in that area that they want to walk with their kids to school, but that crossing this intersection was really difficult, even though it has a signal there that was initially permissive left turns. So a lot of pedestrians would be crossing, or they'd be walking along 80th, crossing Aurora Avenue, and Aurora Avenue has about 35,000 ADT, but 80th Street still has a very high volume of 14,000 ADT and a lot of turns. Aurora Avenues are kind of a large commuter street to take you north and south through the city, and initially they were permissive lefts there. And so even though we didn't have a crash pattern there, there was a lot of, it felt very uncomfortable as a pedestrian, especially if you were a parent with your child. Because of the feeling of unsafety in this area, a lot of the parents even went so far as to kind of do what they called walking school buses, where they would group up with other groups of parents, specifically just because they felt less safe at this intersection. They wanted to kind of create a larger space. So we did end up implementing that pedestrian inhibit feature that Chris had talked about, so I don't think I need to go too far into that. He did a great job presenting on what that actually was, but we also did implement a flashing yellow arrow at the same time. Previously, there was no arrow of any kind. It was just permissive lefts. And so it's the flashing yellow arrow when the ped button hasn't been hit, but otherwise it's the protected left arrow. And then kind of another example of signal separation we've done in the city of Seattle. In this case, it was implemented alongside with a protected bike lane project. The downtown, this is the existing condition or previous condition where you had just permissive lefts, one-way to one-way streets, but a high volume of left turn hook crashes, specifically for bikes. That was kind of the impetus for this project. So we added protected and lagging lefts to the intersection, but it has the extra benefit of also providing a separated pedestrian phase along that corridor. So bikes and peds get to go first, and then left turns get to lag afterwards. Even though we didn't have a large volume of pedestrian crash data out there, we did show that at these specific intersections where they were turning left, we reduced crashes by 80%. And another type of treatment would be the all-way walk, also commonly referred to as the Barnes dance or pedestrian scramble. This allows diagonal movements during pedestrian-only phasing, and so typically you would have all of your vehicles do their movements, north, south, east, west, and then you would have a pedestrian-only phase. We use these in areas with high pedestrian volumes where there are existing desire lines kind of in all directions. So you have a business corridor or an area where campuses or other types of tourist attractions, there's going to be a lot of benefit to providing something like this. Fully separated signals, we can also restrict or allow movements during vehicle phases. It's also good for increased pedestrian comfort, but we have to note that it could increase pedestrian delay. So one of the issues with all-way walks would be the fact that pedestrians have to wait to cross the street, so like much longer than maybe typical, where if you had an east-west or north-south parallel pedestrian movements, if they're trying to get in the diagonal direction, they can typically cross in one direction and then cross in the other, and it may save them time. For this type of treatment, you may want to consider a blended pedestrian ramp for ADA as well. And just another few examples we have that where we've actually implemented it. Our First Avenue corridor has a large volume of pedestrians as well as many different types of tourist attractions. First in Cherry, we installed this in 2010. We had 3 injuries prior to that in the 8 years prior. And in the 8 years afterwards, we have had 0. And in the picture here, you can kind of see some of those diagonal crosswalk markings there. Similar location at First and University, another half-mile down the road from that initial location. Higher ADTs, this is closer to our downtown core, and also 0 pedestrian crashes, period, since we've installed that in 2010. And then a third location in one of our West Seattle neighborhoods at California and Alaska. This one was installed in 1952, so it was one of the original kind of all-way walks that was done in the country. Still decent ADTs on this corridor, but 0 pedestrian crashes since I was actually really surprised when I dove into this data just to look at it, that we've had, even though you have a busy business district here and a lot of vehicle volumes, as well as a lot of vehicle turns, pretty much everyone's acting compliantly here, and we've had just 0 ped crashes, as well as even vehicular crashes. We have maybe 1 PDO crash a year at this intersection, which, based on how wide the road looks, is somewhat surprising. And then just wanted to differentiate a little bit between an all-way walk and an all-walk phase. The one disadvantage to an all-way walk is you do have to provide for those diagonal movements, and if you have a wide and large intersection, it's going to add, you might have to increase your cycle length and maybe potentially, increase the delay to motor vehicles or decrease your LOS to a point where it may not be beneficial. So kind of a in-between solution would just be an all-walk phase where you turn on all the walk signals at the same time, but you don't allow enough clearance time for a diagonal crossing, so that you can still kind of get some of those benefits of fully signal separating pedestrians and vehicles. And then kind of getting into our uncontrolled intersection treatments, just left turn lanes in general. It sounds really simple and basic, but it's listed as one of the FHWA proven safety countermeasures that's shown to reduce crashes by 30 to 40% by just installing a left turn lane. Anecdotally, you would, understand that this reduces the stress on a driver, reduces the pressure. In a situation where it's an active travel lane, they may feel pressured by vehicles behind them to make a quicker turn, in which case you're probably not looking for pedestrians as much, you're just looking for those gaps in vehicular traffic. Also really beneficial if there's a high number of driveway cuts, just because you're increasing your pedestrian exposure along the corridor. And a great and easy way to implement continuous left turns along a corridor, the 2-way left turn median would be through road diets. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that for a second. For those that are unfamiliar, road diets would typically take a 4-lane road and turn into a 3-lane road, where you'd have go from 2 lanes in each direction to 1 lane in each direction, and add in that 2-way left turn median. These have a high benefit of reducing all crashes, mid-block intersection, and all turning crashes by up to 30%, or at least 27% based on the FHWA. Typical is a 4 to 3 lane, but you could also go from a 5 lane to a 3 lane and maybe add in some sort of bicycle facility. Again, you really get the benefits from adding in that center left turn median, where you allow vehicles to pull out of the flow of traffic and be patient and look for oncoming gaps in traffic, as well as pedestrians along those side streets. And they can be done on decently high roads, up to 20,000 ADT with low LOS impacts, and I've worked on several projects that have approached that 20,000 ADT mark. Another good uncontrolled intersection approach would just be left turn restrictions. Get rid of that conflict point altogether as a left turn. Usually you want to formalize it in some way using hardscape. And this is a good way to couple with pedestrian medians, which just in general, even though it's not a left turning crash pattern, has a good crash reduction factor associated with it as well. This is a location in our North District at 92nd Street in Aurora. Aurora is that same street I mentioned earlier with the school crossing that has 35,000 ADT. It's just a little further up the road from that school. We restricted our left turns here and added in a pedestrian signal there. So this is ped actuated crossing button as well. So peds can hit the button and turn the light red and then cross the street. Here's the look from the side street. So it's right in and right only from the side streets. So we've eliminated that left turn crash pattern with pedestrians, as well as just a left turning angle crash with oncoming vehicles. And just kind of getting into, what can you do on residential streets as another alternative if you have some issues with cut through traffic or some sort of other type of pattern where you're seeing left turn crashes in residential areas. Traffic circles are a great way to slow down vehicle speeds and slow down that turning movement. And so I just kind of wanted to showcase a few examples that can be done for a low speed, low volume environment if you're still concerned about left turn crashes. And that is it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bradley. That was great. I love the exploration of some of those other projects toward the end. I mean, I think they all address left turns, but a lot of different settings to be thinking about as we approach our own project. So let me get back to my slide here. You all should see the contact information for our panelists, which, I think I'm predicting that we may not get to every single question that came in. And if we don't, I hope that you will be able to reach out to our panelists individually. Their email addresses are up online. We can also help facilitate that exchange of information if you just contact us. I want to get back to some of the early questions or the information that Libby shared with us on crash data. We got a lot of follow-up questions about, did you look at this various factor? Were you able to identify alcohol use as it pertains to this crash problem by either the pedestrian or the bicyclist? Another question about whether we can discern if the pedestrian, when struck, was walking against the signal or with the walk signal. And so, Libby, a lot of those came up. I think I maybe know the answer to some of them, but can you speak generally about the data, the granularity of the data, and what is and isn't easy to figure out?
Okay, thanks, Dan. Thanks for the question. Yeah, there are many factors and behavioral issues that we could have explored, and we did not dive into all of those things. Some of them are difficult to tease out just from the crash data alone, like was there really a level of impairment there and things like that. So we didn't explore those data so much this time. Regarding whether the pedestrian violated, again, it's difficult because contributing circumstances are reported so differently by all the states, and some states report up to 3 different factors, so it becomes really a challenge to look at those data on a whole database level. We didn't go to that level this time, but you could definitely look, once you get down to diagnosis, you can look at those individual crash reports for a location, and you can explore those kinds of details in more depth. But we're trying to look at the general types of conflict patterns here and what kinds of kind of big picture things tend to be overrepresented. But one thing I mentioned to Dan, though, was the perpendicular path type of crash where it occurred at a signalized intersection. That is more likely to involve a violation by the pedestrian if they're crossing in front of the motor vehicle who has a turn or a right of way there. Whereas when they're on parallel paths, it's less likely. It's not unheard of, but it's much less likely.
Thank you, Libby. And I guess, Bradley, that question to you as well. In your own data, were you able to pull out any other kind of specifics from the factors associated with these crashes that maybe we don't know based on looking kind of at the more high-level national data? Were you able to drill down to any specific factors?
I guess when I was speaking about I had the downtown crashes and the downtown crash pattern, I actually personally read through every single crash report for those things just to kind of gleam out, in the narrative, was there anything unique or bizarre going on, or were there any kind of other patterns that we didn't see kind of in the raw data? And really, I mean, I'd say almost all of them, 90 to 95% of those crashes were at a permissive turn intersection. Now, it was one way to one way, so it's curbside to curbside, but where the pedestrian had the walk signal and the driver had the green light, and it was just kind of a right-of-way violation issue. Very rarely did any of those crashes involve rights on red or lefts on red. It was almost always where both users were getting that kind of green signal and the vehicle, left-turning vehicle, was just failing to see the pedestrian. But other than that, we haven't been able to tease out any other thing out of that data that we've noticed.
Yeah, there's a follow-up there, and maybe the answer is no if you haven't been able to tease out too much more, but there's a question for you. In that higher density area downtown that you looked at, did you notice any patterns or differences in the AM or PM peak periods when these crashes were occurring, or if it was about even maybe?
Nothing really stood out. Actually, initially when we made that diagram, we actually added the time of day. We kind of added like a little number to each of those crashes and kind of looked at it by AM, PM, night, day, and there wasn't anything that really jumped out at us. I think that there's definitely a little bit more of a higher percentage during the peak periods when you have a lot of people, especially in the evening, right, trying to get home from work, turn on the interstate, as well as pedestrians just trying to catch their bus. But it wasn't as statistically significant as we thought it would be. We kind of were expecting that more, but I mean, a lot of these crashes happened at off-peak times of the day when you would expect lower volumes of pedestrians and lower volumes of vehicles.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. A couple questions for Chris and Dave. Regarding some of the vehicle simulation stuff that you shared, it was very cool. A lot of positive comments about that, and curiosity about what more we can use kind of this sort of technology to understand. And I'm wondering if from your research and what you looked at, do you consider that there are any, or would you maybe offer any recommendations that those involved in vehicle design might consider from what you're seeing the driver look at from behind the wheel? And I just wonder about the ways in which some of those pillars in the vehicle, for example, may hide various parts of the crosswalk during that left turn. I just wonder if any of this research is being used to kind of inform and maybe make recommendations for how our vehicles might accommodate a more open view of what's going on.
I think that's an exceptional point. There are labs that work in close collaboration with OEMs on designing things like the HMI displays in the vehicle and consider where we place information, whether it's on the rear view or the instrument panel or the side view mirrors. And I think that there are opportunities to spend more time thinking about the human factors design of some of those spaces. That little video clip that we showed probably emphasized the fact that those A-pillars are problematic. There's competing design characteristics. We're making them larger so that the structural cage is stronger and that we can reduce the forces that subjects in the vehicle are exposed to when a crash occurs. But as a consequence, they have gotten larger over time, reducing our functional field of view. There's actually a colleague of mine here at OSU that does some research on making those columns transparent in automobiles to increase the visual field of drivers. So I think that's a great question.
I wonder if, as maybe a lot of folks on the line are thinking about this problem not only from the design and the engineering perspective, but is there anything in terms of education or messaging or awareness raising that we could do to help solve this problem? I don't think any of that alone will solve it, but we did talk about in our motorist overtaking bicyclist webinar about providing some awareness and education about safe passing distances, for example, these sorts of things. And I wonder, from the human factors research and what you gleaned from where people are looking and when, do you see an effective opportunity to develop a message or provide this awareness of this crash problem for drivers or for pedestrians in these scenarios?
I think that's a great question. Chris and I have been working on, as he mentioned, a number of projects over time. And one of the interesting findings that we generated from thinking about most recently is some failure in driver decision making as we think about their situational awareness and their projection of forward trajectories for conflicting parties as they perform rights in conflict with bicycles. So we found that in 25% of cases, drivers correctly detected following bicyclist to their right in an adjacent bicycle lane and assumed that that bicycle would either yield the right of way to them as the car turned in front of them, or that they had enough time and space to perform that maneuver. And in the state of Oregon, that assumption that the bicyclist would yield to them is contrary to the legal framework that we have. We've identified a handful of cases where relatively simple, either traffic control device-based messaging or legal standards are not well understood by the majority of drivers. That's one small example. So I absolutely think that there's an opportunity to improve our information and educational campaigning to raise the awareness about correct interpretations and behaviors.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I guess just add to that I mean, obviously, there's always a place for education of both drivers and pedestrians, but in this case, I think it's pretty clear from the data and just from from the human factors perspective that this can be a challenging situation, and we should think carefully about how we set this up. So if we just want to allow left turns over the pedestrian, we're going to get this crash type, and so we should think about trying to be a little bit more thoughtful and smarter about that. And I know this in the city of Portland, their Vision Zero exercise, this particular crash type on their high crash corridors is problematic, and they're looking at some other things besides signal timing, some geometric modifications that the New York DOT has sort of been testing and implementing, trying to make that left turn maneuver a little bit less comfortable for drivers, narrowing it using medians and other geometry. So I think there's a big role for engineering and design in this crash type.
Do you want to say anything about the protected intersection design that a number of us are studying, trying to look at now, and how that can also potentially relieve some of the pressure on turning drivers and give them an opportunity to?
Yeah, right. That's a good point, Libby. Some of the intersection designs for when there's a separated bicycle or a protected bicycle lane approaching an intersection bends the bicycle lane out so that a turning vehicle would have enough space to get out of the turning lane and wait while they yield to pedestrians. And so that does have the option to sort of relieve some of that the pressure drivers feel in the right turning space. I don't know if you want to add more.
Yeah, I think in the left turning space as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I have another question, getting back over to Bradley. You talked a lot about some of the approaches you've taken on these various projects. where you're prioritizing some of these left turns for additional treatments, whether that's a restricted phase, LPI, some of these other things. And a lot of questions about kind of how you approach that decision making. It seems like there might be an opportunity to look first at, okay, where do I have the highest pedestrian crossing volumes, or possibly looking at locations where you've got the most left turn movements, or is it a combination of both? How do you kind of start to drill down to some of these locations, or is it truly from this crash data that you shared with us in that one example?
Yeah, there's a few different. I mean, there's obviously a multitude of projects. Many of these aren't necessarily standalone projects. So some of the examples with the school with the pedestrian inhibited left turn, as well as the left turn restriction with the ped median, those are parts of neighborhood greenway projects where we were already kind of looking at a corridor wide project, and we were focusing on pedestrians and people walking to school and people in the neighborhood. So when you get to those major stressful or less comfortable crossings, that's kind of what we were looking at. Was sometimes it's not necessarily purely data driven based on crash data. Sometimes it's very pedestrian comfort driven, right? It's hard to measure that, but if it's not a comfortable place to be, pedestrians aren't going to walk in that space. In terms of some of the other locations we've looked at, there's a few different ways we go about it. One of the things I didn't really touch on here, but we've touched on in other webinars, is that we have this predictive safety model analysis called the BPSA, which is the Bicycle and Pedestrian Safety Analysis tool, which is like very intensive data crunching, where we've looked at data, every single crash for 7 years, looked at all the factors that led to those crashes, as well as just general, what do the streets look like where those crashes occurred? What's the ADT, number of lanes, street width, pedestrian volumes, types of turn lanes. I mean, like a whole bunch of different pieces of data. And over, this took a year and a half for us to develop. But we were able to kind of come up with all these things and then look at other locations around the city where, okay, we're not seeing crash patterns yet, but we are seeing these similar types of features or elements with maybe wider roads or types of speeds or types of configurations. We don't have tons of PED data here. We have pretty low crashes, low volume of crashes here, and so sometimes it's really hard to tease out, how do we attack some of those locations that are, if a crash hasn't happened here for 5 years and then suddenly there's a fatal, and so how do we target that? And so this predictive modeling system helps us target locations where it kind of pumps out a list of like, hey, here are the top, 500 intersections of the city where these are very similar to these existing crash patterns. And so we've used LPIs for those a lot, and that's kind of why I said we're starting to do a lot more LPIs. I think the leading pedestrian interval is a really great starting point at any type of signalized intersection if you're just looking to increase pedestrian comfort as well as pedestrian safety. Is really low impacts to LOS. I mean, it's 3 seconds per phase, but it definitely has high benefits. That's why it's an FHWA proven safety countermeasure, 60% reduction in pedestrian vehicular crashes. Beyond that, yes, we are still continuing to look at the existing crash data, like those downtown locations, to look at, should we do more signal separation? Maybe LPIs aren't enough. Now we're starting with LPIs now, partly just because we don't have, funding can be tough, and this is a really cheap, easy first step. But we could continue to combine that with a, leading pedestrian interval, and then maybe we come back and we do a lagging left turn phase as well. Interestingly enough, in our downtown, we only have one intersection that over the whole length of this, the 7 years of crash data we had for that downtown crash pattern, we had one intersection that has a protected left turn, and it was the one that actually had the highest number of left turn ped crashes there, which is, we had that signal separation, but there's probably more other dynamic things happening there, and all of the crashes that happened were during the pedestrian phase. There weren't any crashes that happened. So it's protected permissive. Sorry, let me back up. It wasn't protected only, it was protected permissive. But it was one of the places where we had that protected and permissive at this time. So, yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of different ways we look at stuff, but we're trying to start with kind of these low-level, cheap, easy to implement everywhere solutions, and then kind of we may be going back in the next year or two, looking at it again, and maybe implementing some higher-level, more targeted locations based on our predictive modeling and our existing crash patterns.
Thank you very much. That's awesome. And I just dropped a link. We covered, another person from Seattle DOT actually talked a couple weeks ago on one of our webinars about that process that Libby was involved with, and other researchers here to look at that risk-based approach. So check that out if you're interested. The last question, we got quite a few questions that I'll pitch to you as our last one of the day about pedestrian push-button use, and that it seems like a number of these treatments we do to talk about pedestrians pushing the button possibly to request the full protected signal phasing or some other signal treatment, and a lot of folks mentioning the fact that not everyone's pushing the button. Maybe pedestrians are just expecting the signal, and I wonder, Chris and Dave first, and then Bradley, if you looked at any applications of more of a pedestrian detection technology that could actually enter pedestrians into the phases without them requiring the push button activation. Is that have you looked at that, and is that something that the community should consider investing some dollars in? It's certainly not an inexpensive fix, but it could be one that doesn't require a pedestrian to actually go out of their way to push that button. I wonder how you feel about that.
Yeah, I guess I'll chime in. I mean, it definitely should be that way, but I think the technology is just not quite there yet. I mean, there is technologies that can do automated, active pedestrian detection at intersections, but at least the ones that I've seen, there's still a lot of issues. Pedestrians don't always stand in the same spot, and so we're not, so maybe some combination with the push button and some active detection, but it's definitely a thing I hope to see solved in the future.
I think Chris is spot on. It's the right direction, but based on every analysis that I've seen, we're not close enough to what really needs to be a 100% accuracy if we're going to deploy it for sort of ped safety applications. It seems like maybe FLIR cameras are going to get us close, but I haven't seen enough comprehensive analysis to know that that's a today's solution. Yeah.
Great. And Bradley, are you all using any of this in Seattle?
I will kind of agree and both disagree with Chris and David. I think that yes is correct. I have dug through and tried to find specifically every single study I could over the last 40 years that related to PED push buttons, and the highest rate of use that I have seen in anything was like 60 to 63%. A lot of studies showed a lot less than that, so we know that it's not working. And yes, in terms of passive detection, like this is the only piece of traffic control equipment where we require a user to manually activate that signal. Everything for vehicles and even some technology for bikes is all automated and passive. And I also think that just from a pedestrian comfort and usability perspective, I'm a big fan of just pedestrian recall. Just make it cheap, make it simple. You might, with ADA, PED push buttons are becoming more necessary, and so you can still install those and leave it on PED recall, and the push button can activate your audible and vibrotactile warning that the PED signal is coming on. But if we want more people to walk and we want to make spaces more accessible and comfortable, I think the PED signal should be coming up more often than not, especially in denser areas or neighborhoods or places where we expect and want people to walk.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that, Bradley, and that in places that you just routinely expect pedestrians, there shouldn't be buttons. We should just have them up on, we should just have it on recall. I think that's good practice, and I know here that in the city of Portland, and I'm sure up in Seattle, that seems to be how we're operating things.
Great. That's great. I totally agree with you all, and I think that's maybe a good challenge for the audience and see if we can get that done more. But I do like the idea of maybe improving our technologies for detection and getting to that maybe as our goal. That's awesome. I'm sad to say that we don't have any time for more questions. We could probably keep going for another half hour. I want to respect your time and our guest time, but I did leave, again, the contact information up on the screen. Please reach out to us if you want to talk any more about this topic. We'd be happy to share more information with you. I want to remind everybody on the line that you're going to be receiving an email later today that'll have a link to our webinar archive page, instructions for downloading your certificate of attendance, a couple of other pieces of information for you. I want to let you know that a brief survey is going to appear once the webinar is ended. We would really appreciate your feedback and your comments on today's presentation, maybe some ideas about what we can cover in future webinars. we'd always like to hear more of those, and we'll be cataloging those for our upcoming sessions. I want to say thank you again to all of our panelists for their presentations today, and thanks to all of you for attending today's PBIC webinar. We hope to see you next time, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you very much.